Our theme for the month of June is wisdom, and I've decided to address that theme by preaching about the wisdom found in some of the sources of our Unitarian Universalist faith. One important source of our tradition, and I would argue that we're all a little bit humanist, at least a little bit. One important source is humanism, and I'll talk about the wisdom that we draw from humanism next week. On the last Sunday in June, I'll take a crack at what is one of my favorite traditions, ancient Stoicism. And a real treat, on June 17th, while I'm across the parking lot talking to the teens about being global citizens, our own Deanne McClenahan will preach a sermon titled The Wisdom of the Crowd, or All I Really Need to Know I Learned from UUs. I'm jealous that you get to hear Deanne preach in person. I don't know where she went. Said nice things about her and she wasn't even in the room. Well, but today I want to talk about wisdom from what is maybe the world's oldest religious tradition, Hinduism. Here's the thing. Hinduism is complex and rich and absolutely enormous, both in terms of its over 1 billion adherents and its theological and cultural diversity. And it would be possible just to offer 3 or 4 nice ideas from that tradition that we can be inspired by. But 2 things keep me from doing only that. First, Unitarian Universalism has a deep and long connection with Hinduism, and I want to explore one of those connections. And second, I want to acknowledge the Hindu tradition in its fullness. Sometimes liberal religious folks approach world religions, especially Eastern ones, as being only repositories of ancient wisdom. But if that were true, it would make these traditions less human institutions and more, frankly, caricatures, liberal utopian visions of another culture. So today I'll weave some of Hinduism's core teachings in with a story that also gets at some of Hinduism's more difficult tendencies. The story begins in the year 1812. Ramamohan Roy was attending his brother's funeral at the Calcutta cremation grounds in India, and he knew what to expect that day. There would be a large wooden funeral pyre. His brother's body would be placed on the pyre and burned. His ashes floated in the sacred river by the grieving family. But someone else would also die that day. Roy's family were members of an upper caste that practiced sati, or burning the widow with her husband's body. It was believed that the widow and her husband would then enter paradise together, and that the widow would be released from the cycle of death and rebirth because she was willing to go with her husband even to death. And so Ramamohan watched his family tie down his sister-in-law and burn her alive. That day made him a crusader for the abolition of that practice. In the years after her death, he often traveled to the cremation grounds to try and talk people out of burning widows in their own families. It was finally abolished in 1829, in large part due to his efforts and his relationships with officials. But the practice, as Ramamohan saw it, was just one of the many pieces of evidence that his faith tradition had been taken captive by literalists. These were his words. He argued for what one biographer has called, quote, a rational, ethical, non-authoritarian, this-worldly, and social reform Hinduism. Hinduism is often characterized by Westerners as a polytheistic religion, many gods, and that's kind of right. If you enter the worship space of a Hindu person, you're likely to see mainly one divine image, sometimes surrounded by others. I was in the home of a Hindu woman some years ago whose altar featured images of her guru and a family god surrounded by images of Jesus, who for her was an important teacher. There is tremendous diversity in Hinduism. But in Hinduism, it isn't exactly true that the various avatars are gods themselves. Hindus teach that behind and around and in everything, There is one ultimate reality, Brahman, the power and source of the universe. Brahman is what is, and in everything there's a bit of Brahman. In the animals, in the trees, and us, Brahman is pulsating and sustaining life. And the goal of religious practice, which for most can't be separated completely from everyday life, the goal of practice is to become one with Brahman. This is an oversimplification, but I only have 20 minutes. There are a lot of paths to that oneness. One is yoga, the submission of the body to the spirit. Another practice that often accompanies yoga is meditation on images of Brahman in various incarnations. So you might meditate on a statue of Shiva dancing with 4 arms outstretched, reminding you that Brahman dances inside you. Or maybe you'd use an image of Krishna driving his chariot into battle to remind you the one who is in control of her desire is on the way to oneness with Brahman. I used to meditate. Can we throw up the image of the painting? That's not it. I used to meditate on this painting. I came across it in the home of a Hindu woman with whom I meditated now and then in Indiana. Here, Krishna is playing a golden flute. The flute is you and me. The 8 holes symbolize our 5 senses, plus mind, intellect, and ego. The divine breath flows through each of us. And if we can really be open to it, and if the 8 of our senses and our ego and all those things are in the right sort of position at the right time, that all-encompassing love can embody us to create such beautiful music that all of nature will stop to hear it. The key is submitting our egos to the divine breath. I think one could meditate on that image for a lifetime. All of these are images of what we can be. All of these are images of the one divinity, of the force behind it all at work in the world. At least that's the way many Hindus see things. That includes my colleague, Reverend Manish Mishra, who's a Hindu Unitarian Universalist serving a congregation near Washington, D.C. Here's what he said about his faith in a recent sermon. My experience with Unitarian Universalism has encouraged me to take from Hinduism what made sense and to leave the rest behind. And so I did that. I left behind things like the caste system and its social oppression, the culture of subjugation of women, and the cultural rejection of homosexuality. I did not have to accept those aspects of the Hindu faith and culture, and I didn't. But at the same time, I also didn't have to toss out everything. He says, I discovered a newfound richness in the mythology of Hinduism. I had been taught to understand the stories literally, and I didn't have to do that. I could understand them metaphorically, as symbols of what life can teach us. I could look at Hinduism through the lens of Unitarian Universalism and reinterpret traditional ideas with contemporary meaning. I was encouraged by this faith and this congregation, he says, to claim my Hindu heritage. And in doing so, as I often share with others, I feel that Unitarian Universalism has made me a better Hindu, end quote. Hinduism is a living, evolving faith tradition. Like Manish, Ramamohan Roy believed many people took the images in Hinduism far too literally. He believed that over-literal religion was fuel for horrible social practices, including widow burning and the caste system, and that it was at odds with the establishment of a rational scientific society. He wanted to persuade his fellow Hindus toward what he couched as a less superstitious faith. Now, it wasn't that Ramamohan didn't believe in a God of any kind. In fact, he did. But he was a Hindu monotheist. He came across monotheism, the idea that there's one God, when studying the religions. He read the Quran, and it appealed to him. He came to believe in Brahman as the one God, described in the Quran and other places. He used Hindu texts to demonstrate his belief that Hindus should stop over-literalizing idols and to begin to worship Brahman directly. He used especially the notion that's included in some ancient Hindu texts that Brahman is beyond form and attributes, not so unlike the Hebrew Bible's command to not make any images of God. Brahman isn't really any of the images that are being worshipped, he said. Brahman is a formless essence. Biographer notes that in 1804 he published a tract called A Gift to Monotheists. It criticized existing religions based on irrationality, deception, intolerance, and what he called unjust social control. He said, falsehood is common to all religions without distinction. He advocated instead faith in one being and the universal morality of doing no harm to other people. Every person, he wrote, quote, should exercise their own intellectual power with the help of acquired knowledge to discern good from bad, so that this valuable divine gift should not be left useless, end quote. Ramahun did become enamored of Christianity. Not Christianity exactly, Jesus' teachings more specifically. He saw in Jesus' teachings an emphasis on morality and rationality that suit him. In 1820, he published a pamphlet titled The Precepts of Jesus, the Guide to Peace and Happiness, to introduce his fellow Indians to Jesus. But, as Unitarian historian Earl Morse Wilbur wrote, the English missionaries in India were not happy. He said, instead of welcoming such an introduction of Hindus to the teachings of Jesus, they attacked it sharply in print as the attempt of a heathen to mislead the Hindus by a garbled version of Christianity. The little book had indeed not only omitted the miraculous of Jesus from his selections, but made no mention of the deity of Jesus or Jesus' atonement for our sins, and had even opposed the doctrine of the Trinity. So essentially, he put out a pamphlet that contained only Jesus' teachings, none of his miracles, no talk about being the divine Son of God, and the missionaries, the Christian missionaries, were none too happy. To be clear, though, Ramu never wanted to leave Hinduism. He wanted to reform the faith tradition that he loved. He wanted to abolish the caste system and some of the other practices that he saw as abusive. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that a religion as ancient as Hinduism has been practiced the same way for thousands of years. The truth is that, as is the case with Christianity and Islam and Judaism and Unitarian Universalism, Hinduism is a vibrant, changing faith with people who are literalists and people who are not, people who are deeply committed practitioners and people who are more casual about their faith. Ramohun Roy was a Hindu reformer. Of course, as is the fate of most reformers, he was not uniformly loved. The biographer I quoted above says, although in his studies he intended to establish Hinduism as a defensible modern religion in the face of Christian challenges, his Hindu opponents called him an atheist, a destroyer of religion, and a sinful modern. He was hearing it from all sides. He found in the Unitarians like minds and willing partners. He worked with a minister, a Baptist minister who had become Unitarian, to form the Calcutta Unitarian Committee. Later, he organized the Brahmo Samaj, which exists still today. It's a place of worship in which the early services looked a lot like Unitarian services of the British who occupied Ramohun Roy's India. They include hymn singing and a sermon and time for contemplation. It's the combination of East and West, of Hinduism and Unitarianism, at least in its Christian form in the 19th century. In 1900, the Brahmo Samaj helped found the International Council of Unitarian and other liberal religious thinkers and workers. Its founding document says, the Brahmo Samaj does not discriminate between caste, creed, or religion, and is an assembly of all sorts and descriptions of people without distinction, meeting publicly for the sober, orderly, religious, and devout adoration of the nameless, unsearchable, eternal, immutable being who is the author and preserver of the universe. There's more to say about Ramohun Roy. But his life and the enduring legacy of the Brahmo Samaj remind me of the vibrant diversity that is the Hindu faith. It contains so many of these movements that reform, some of which were more successful and some less. His spirit lives on in the many present-day reformers in every tradition, in every faith, including ours. May we each remember that, like Krishna's golden flute, we're called to be vessels of the highest and best in the universe. That great force may take many forms, but in its purest essence, the holy is one. Like Brahman, humanity takes many forms. We are both richly diverse and one in unity. There are forces at work in the world today that would have us believe otherwise, that would pit us against one another for their benefit. But may we never forget Ramohun's central message. Separation is an illusion. All is one. May we be so. Amen.